Good evening, everyone. Tonight marks the last session of our 4-day Borah Symposium series. We've had a series of interesting presentations in the past, and tonight promises to be one of those fine presentations we've witnessed. I have here two experienced people from two lesser-known countries as compared to South Africa, but we have a lot to learn tonight. We have Mr. Mason Smith from Fiji and Professor Ken Atafua from Ghana. It's going to be an interactive session. So one speaker speaks first, the second comes, and then the two interact, and then we have a question and answer session. So to say something brief about Mr. Mason Smith, our first speaker. He's the Deputy Permanent Representative and Acting Head of Mission of the Fiji Mission to the UN. He possesses 2 graduate degrees in diplomacy and defense studies. He has spent much of his career prior to receiving those degrees in both the foreign ministry and in the Fiji military force posts. He has undertaken peacekeeping missions in many countries, including Lebanon, Egypt, Iraq, Kuwait, East Timor, and Bongaville. He's presently a member of and actively involved in the Fijian Peacebuilding Commission. And he's very much interested in the nexus between peacekeeping and preventive diplomacy on the one hand, and peacekeeping, peace building, and long-term recovery of countries emerging from conflict on the other. At the center of these two divides is the role of reconciliation, and it is for this reason that we invite him here tonight. So let's welcome Mr. Mason Smith.
Thank you very much for those kind words of introduction. And thank you, University of Idaho, for the warm welcome extended to both myself and the good professor, and for making us welcome in your homes and in the university. Last night I promised myself that I would try and find another excuse to come to Idaho. And I must now reconcile that promise with the fulfillment to further explore your very scenic state. Once again, University of Idaho, thank you very much for the warm welcome you have extended to both myself and Professor Ken. Ladies and gentlemen, let me also take this opportunity to thank Dr. Bill Smith and the organizing committee of the Borah Symposium for inviting us to speak to you today on a topic that is near and dear to my heart, that of reconciliation. Tonight, Professor Ken and I have been requested to share our insights into the challenges of reconciliation. Last night you heard experiences from South Africa. Tonight you will hear from perhaps 2 lesser countries on the difference in how we go about reconciliation and the challenges that we face. Earlier today, I spoke to some of you on the reconciliation efforts currently underway in Fiji. And I would like to round off that tonight by providing you with a very short overview of some of the very major challenges that we face as a small island developing state in the South Pacific, and some of our very painful and ongoing reconciliation efforts. I will premise my discussion tonight around what I consider to be the 4 fundamental pillars of the reconciliation cycle. These are truth-telling, apologizing, and accepting responsibilities, justice building, and last but not least, healing within the reconciliation process. So what are some of the major challenges to truth-telling in Fiji? To tell you the truth, this is one of the more challenging aspects of our own reconciliation effort, given the lack or the absence of trust that is evident amongst all parties concerned. Investigative truth-telling that is required either through the truth commissions that we've established or through the courts, often than not involves the offender giving a past experience, detailing past injustices, hurt, and sometimes blame. It often looks at the historical incidents of the crimes that were carried out against the minority groups by the offender against the victim, his community, or political acts against the nation. For us in Fiji, the major challenges to investigative truth-telling are as follows. First of all, truth-telling often takes a lot of time and consumes a lot of resources and expertise that we do not have. Major nations like South Africa and perhaps Ghana may have these resources. We in Fiji lack the resources and the expertise to carry out truth-telling in its entirety. So how do we speed up this process that often involves thousands of offenders and at the same time ensure that the end product is acceptable to everyone in society? Furthermore, these truth-telling sessions often describe only the symptoms required to facilitate reconciliation. It often does not, in my view, solve the underlying fundamental causes to the conflict that we in Fiji face today, and for which the nation must find a solution if reconciliation in Fiji is to be permanent and lasting. One of the challenges we face is how do we deal with the past. For us, it is not a simple or easy cut-and-paste solution of using a reconciliation model from another country. We in Fiji are still grasping on how to deal with our own past. Narrative truth-telling involving the victim's story is also a major challenge we face in Fiji. The options faced by the victim are both daunting and challenging. He or she can either tell their story in court, in a court of law, or in front of the Truth Commission. What do these two options mean for the victim, insofar as compensation is concerned? Again, these are the challenges and questions we are grappling with in Fiji. I now want to touch very briefly on the challenges we are facing with when dealing with the issue of apologizing and accepting responsibility by the offender. The major challenge we face in Fiji is the tension between traditional, customary reconciliation and contemporary reconciliation. Let me explain. In a traditional Fijian society, if a person offends another, it is most likely that the offender's chief or tribe or spokesman from within the tribe will participate in the reconciliation process. The offender merely sits off to the side, observing the process. He himself is neither repentant, nor does he personally accept responsibility for his actions. The chief or the spokesman from within his tribe will ask forgiveness on his behalf. And this is the tension between traditional and contemporary reconciliation that I am referring to, and one which we are trying to tackle. I am of the view that unless an offender personally apologizes to the victim and acknowledges his own role and responsibility in the offense that he has committed, there cannot be full closure to the reconciliation process. It should not be a third-party process. Instead, it should be a personal conversation between the offender and the victim. Unfortunately, in our stage of national development, there is still this tension between the traditional process of reconciling and the contemporary process that we are trying to introduce. I will now wish to touch very briefly again on justice building, because this is another hurdle that we have to navigate with caution in Fiji. We must find a balance between retributive justice and stopping the coup culture that has gained notoriety in Fiji, on one hand, versus the concept of amnesty on the other. Finding the delicate balance is indeed a major challenge for my young nation. The concept of restorative justice is always one which a lot of questions are being asked. Who is going to fund victim restorative justice? Should the state pay? In our case, we simply do not have the money to pay for all the damages that have been done in the past and that have been committed by thousands of offenders. Should not the offender pay is often the question that is asked. These are the hard questions being asked of us in Fiji. Now, a word or two on healing. Personal healing is somewhat a foreign concept to a lot of indigenous people in traditional Fijian societies. In these traditional societies in Fiji, people are told to be submissive and to bear their cross in silence. This culture of silence is in stark contrast to the requirements of personal healing. When an offender or victim shares their pain and sorrow and burden in public. Again, this is a challenge that we are dealing with through education and peer example, and to trying to encourage our indigenous people to take on this journey of personal healing. Community healing, on the other hand, is readily understood simply because it is already practiced in traditional Fijian societies. Finally, a word on the role of the media. A lot have been said about the rights of the media. However, little is often said about the responsibilities and the need for the media to handle reconciliation stories in a very delicate and sensitive matter that is conducive to permanent reconciliation. The challenge then for us in the Pacific is training journalists to understand the issues behind reconciliation and to encourage them to play a more positive role in reconciliation within our traditional society and in the nation as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, I have tried to articulate to you tonight some of the operational challenges relating to reconciliation, namely challenges relating to truth-telling, apologizing and accepting responsibilities, justice building, healing, and last but not least, a very few words on the challenging role of the media. I thank you for your attention, and I'll be most glad to take your questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. I now introduce Professor Kenneth Ajiman Atafua. He always corrects me. Professor Ken Ajiman Atafua from Ghana. Professor Atafua holds a PhD in criminology from the Simon Fraser University in Canada, Vancouver, Canada. And his experience spans across the academic and non-academic fields. Before moving to Ghana, he served as a commissioner for human rights in British Columbia. In Ghana, he assumed an academic post at the Ghana Institute of Management and Public Administration, where he taught a graduate course in governance and leadership at the Graduate School of Public Management in that school. He later served as the Executive Secretary of the Ghana National Reconciliation Commission, and that is of particular importance to us this evening. Professor Atafua has also trained commissioners, lawyers, investigators, and gender specialists for several organizations, such as the Tanzania Commission on Human Rights and Good Governance, the Permanent Commission on Human Rights of Zambia, the Human Rights Commission of Malawi, and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in such fields as adjudication, investigations, conflict resolution, and corporate management. He received a number of awards in his work in Canada and is currently a practicing barrister and the executive director of the Justice and Human Rights Institute in Accra, an agency he founded, actually. So please let's welcome Professor Atafua from Ghana.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor for me to be here tonight to join forces with my colleague, Mr. Mason Smith, to share some thoughts with you on the topic of balancing human rights, justice, and peace in the context of reconciliation. And I do so from the perspective of a person who has been intimately connected with the administration of a truth commission in 2 truth commissions in Africa. First, in my home country, Ghana, as the executive secretary of the commission, and second, as the UN's international technical advisor to the Truth Commission of Liberia. And within the context of the former, also had the privilege of looking at truth commissions in Sierra Leone, in Peru, in East Timor, among others. And of course, on the continent of Africa, the primary or the parent Truth Commission, the South African TRC. But I must begin by first associating myself with the comments made by Mr. Mason with respect to the gratitude that he and I both feel towards the Borah Committee in particular and the University of Idaho in general, and to this wonderful and warm community that has welcomed us for the last couple of days, in my case, for the last week, into your midst. I take away with me very fond memories of this place, and I am particularly grateful for the snow, which you very warmly called for me. I would like to say, by way of context, in order to situate the subsequent comments I'll make about challenges in Truth Commission work, that with particular reference to Ghana, we're talking of a country of about 24 million people, which gained political independence from colonial Britain in 1957, and had this political history punctuated and truncated by a number of military interventions, particularly 4 successful coups d'etats, each of which occasioned significant human rights violations in the country. And the 3 civilian administrations, or the civilian constitutional governments, that were removed by the military governments or the military juntas, also occasioned egregious human rights violations on the citizenry and on the foreigners who lived in our country. Most notably, military intervention in 1966, another in 1972, another in 1979, and then in 1981, December 31st. Each of these was a site of large-scale violations that drove thousands of Ghanaians into exile. Our commission was established in May 2002 with a mandate to excavate the history of egregious human rights violations, to document those violations, and to make recommendations for the prevention of such violations in the future. The Commission was primarily an investigative body, but it was clothed with the judicial powers of a high court. In other words, it could subpoena witnesses to testify before it, and people could be held in contempt if they failed to honor an invitation by way of a subpoena issuing from the Commission. But it wasn't a court, in that it could not impose punishments on people. The Commission started its work by opening its doors to the generality of the Ghanaian populace and inviting them to make statements to it about any human rights violations they might personally have suffered or of which they might have knowledge. In the course of its work, it received 4,420 petitions, and it gave an opportunity to about 2,000, a little over 2,000 people to testify before it, either openly, such as in this venue, or in venues like this, or in-camera hearings or private hearings, especially for cases that were sensitive, those dealing with gender-based violence, rape, and that some of those that had implications for national security, or indeed for the personal safety and security of the witness or some other person. But at the end of the day, the Commission succeeded in providing a platform, a forum, for those who wished to complain, for those who wished to testify about the violations they had suffered, to tell their stories. 79 respondents in all took advantage of the opportunity offered by the Commission to confront the allegations made against them, to testify in their self-defense if they so wished, and sometimes to admit their wrongdoing and to apologize to the victims. We promoted reconciliation, and we submitted our report to the President of the Republic as required by the enabling statute, the act that set up the Commission. The Commission comprised 9 members, 3 women and 6 men, selected for their ability to be impartial, persons of great eminence in Ghanaian society, and supported by a public service or a civil service staff, of which I was head. The Commission faced a number of challenges. And by the time its work was over, it had become the first on the continent of Africa to have been able to undertake its assignment within the allotted time and within budget, and indeed to return some of the monies that had been provided to government coffers. I believe that it was a commission that was well managed. I believe that it was a commission that conducted its business with credibility and efficiency. And I believe that it was a commission that largely succeeded in fulfilling the mandate that had been entrusted to it. But like all human institutions, the National Reconciliation Commission of Ghana also suffered from a number of failings. And the rest of my remarks will touch on the challenges that the Commission faced. First, let me say that not unique to the Ghanaian Commission, but shared by virtually all Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, is number one, the competing conceptions of the critical elements of its work. What is truth? What is reconciliation? What is justice? And what do we mean by forgiveness and healing and amnesty and accountability? Concepts that lie at the heart of the work of a Truth Commission. There are varied conceptions of these very concepts or terminologies, but it's not just an academic discourse. It goes to the heart. It is profound to the nature of the work of the commission and how the commission is perceived and responded to. And so, for example, in the context of Ghana, many people articulated different versions of reconciliation. Many people articulated and expected that the commission would meet their particular versions of truth, often juxtaposing a forensic conception of truth, truth that is empirical, that is testable, that is all tested, truth that is concrete, that we can all, as it were, verify, against the testimony of that poor woman who was saying in January 2004 that in 1979 June or July, she was subjected to this form of violation or the other. And some people were saying, well, where is the evidence? She said she was raped. Where is the evidence? Where is the medical report? Or those who suffered violations dating as far back as 1958. When I had occasion to speak this morning to some of our colleagues, I pointed out the story of a man who had carried with him the burdens and pain of a violation he suffered as far back as 1958, when the blood-soaked shirt that he wore that afternoon, he had kept and he brought to the commission some 30-something years later, from 1958 to 2003. I've forgotten my mathematics. Suffice it to say that such competing conceptions of these very ideas that lie at the heart of reconciliation work agitated us and sometimes almost succeeded in detracting attention from the core business that we had to deal with. But a second and profound challenge of our Truth Commission, and indeed of other Truth Commissions, is the political and legal context of the birth of the Reconciliation Commissions themselves. Liberia continues to experience significant problems with their Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Some people contending that perhaps it is a little too premature for Liberia to have established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Indeed, I am one of those people who share the view very passionately that had a trial of former Liberian President Charles Ganki Taylor taken place anywhere on the African continent, but especially in the West African sub-region, Liberia at least would have imploded worse than it had done earlier, and that the whole West African sub-region would, in all probability, have been destabilized. But I also believe that in the context of Ghana, the strong personal following of particular powerful political leaders, both past and present, made the business of reconciliation, even the discourse on it, fundamentally problematic. The Reconciliation Commission Act itself was baked in a hot oven of controversy and served on a very hot plate. And when we started our work, many were those who expected that the boycotts and protests against this work would succeed in derailing the commission. And there were serious efforts that were daunting, aimed at derailing the commission. Because, of course, there are legitimate, there are serious interests that would want to see a job like that not succeed. This is about excavating the past, which had been buried under the debris of force and intimidation, and to try and exhume that and shine the torchlight of accountability and transparency into that ignoble past is, to say the least, to undermine the political and social legitimacy of certain people. So the political and legal context almost always, presents a significant problem. Funding of truth commissions is a third major challenge. Countries like South Africa and Liberia come to mind. South Africa, no problem, because South Africa is a relatively rich country. Even so, South Africa welcomed some support from elsewhere. In our case, virtually every single donor looked upon our commission with a bit of skepticism at the beginning, a wait-and-see approach was adopted until the commission got underway with this work, and its credibility and professionalism began to shine. And then the donors, beginning with the United States of America, began to pursue us. In fairness to the United States of America and to the donor community, the first entity to provide support was the George Soros Foundation, which has an enterprising civil society initiative in West Africa called OSIWA, the Open Society Initiative for West Africa, an enterprise aimed at providing funding to civil society to expand the social and political space for dialogue, for discussing on the issues of democracy and peace and stability. And so, as with nearly all things, once the evidence came, the United States and other donors came on board. And we did get some funding, much needed funding from the donor community. But our budget was a small one. We initially, I drew the budget for the commission, designed this operational framework, and initially anticipated that we would require about $5 million to do our work. When we closed our doors on at the end of December 2004, we had spent just about $3 million and were able to return the balance to chess. But some of that, the bulk of that, came from the Ghana government. Another significant, and I say that it is a challenge also because in Liberia, even after I was initially taken to Liberia by the United Nations as a governance or a management consultant to design the framework, the operational framework for the commission, the organogram, the budget, and all of that. And after a series of meetings with the donor community, and I mean a very strong donor community in Liberia, that is a country that has been ravaged by 14 years of, bloody civil war, and a country under reconstruction, still a country under largely United Nations control. And all the donors were there. And after defending the budget and everybody making every comment they could make, doing every fault finding that they could, and getting the thing as polished as shine, yet the funding was not coming. The funding wasn't forthcoming. And eventually it was the poor Liberian state, the government of Liberia, struggling to get itself off the ground, that had to provide the initial seed money for the operation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Much later, over a year after it started its operations, and no doubt also because of its own internal problems of gross mismanagement and incompetence and other shortcomings, it was the George Soros Foundation, once again, that went first to the aid of the Liberian people by way of support to the Truth Commission. And then later on, Norway, Sweden, United States, and other countries. But these are the usuals. What about the actual operational challenges? These are conceptual and logistical problems. But the actual operational challenges that the Truth Commission faces, in my view, notable one is managing public expectations, first of the outcomes or the benefits of reconciliation. Many are those who think of reconciliation as an event that, I will go to the commission and testify, and lo and behold, I shall be made whole. It is like, touch me, master, and I shall be clean. And it doesn't work like that. Reconciliation is a process, not an event. And managing that public expectation, getting the generality of the public to appreciate that this is not a one-day phenomenon, that we are in this for the long haul. South Africa concluded its reconciliation process in 1998. South Africa remains largely a non-reconciled society. That is, using a certain definition of reconciliation. And again, I said earlier that there are varied conceptions of it. And so if you are thinking of reconciliation as bringing people who were previously together but who were thrown asunder together to live in peace and harmony, then it is still a raucous journey for South Africa. Black and white are learning to live together. And that indeed is one of the compelling reasons for reconciliation. The former enemies must learn to let go of the past misconceptions and genuine ones, but the grievances that they hold, from the genocidal attitudes to one that is collegial in nature. Managing public expectations of what benefits will come to them as individuals. In Ghana, there was widespread suspicion that some people would go to the commission and exaggerate the extent of the violations that they suffered, or even lie outrightly in order to get the benefits of monetary compensation. How to get the people and the witnesses themselves to know that this is more about healing in the soul and reconciling with the truth and providing a platform for the nation to rebuild than an opportunity for you to get back what you lost, because no amount of compensation can return a person to the status quo ante, to the position in which they were before the violations took place. So managing public expectations about outcomes, about reparations, especially monetary compensation, about the scale of rehabilitation and the provision of services remain daunting. Liberia continues to suffer these challenges. Indeed, Sierra Leone, that also had a Truth Commission, is facing the challenge of fulfilling the expectations, not necessarily the recommendations of the Truth Commission, but look at the countless numbers of people who became victims of amputation, short sleeve or long sleeve, the wrist cut off or the hand cut off here, or the leg, long sleeve at the ankle or short sleeve somewhere on the thigh or at the knee. And all of these people had different levels of expectations about the scale of rehabilitation that would come their way. And that realization, that expectation has not come to fruitification. Another major challenge is managing the resistance and hostility from former political lords and their supporters. In Ghana, it continues to be a challenge. I still encounter people in restaurants or at car parks or wherever who say, why did you embarrass the military? Or why did you expose the police? Or why do you hate the former president? Or so and so much. And they are from the support base of particular political traditions or orientations. Indeed, in the case of Ghana, on 13 separate occasions, we invited the former president to testify before the commission, and he declined. But unlike Nigeria and unlike South Africa, the Ghana National Reconciliation Commission used its subpoena powers to compel the former president and some of his close, powerful associates to come and testify before the commission, an event that has largely been hailed by Truth Commission observers as distinguishing the Ghana Commission from some of its colleagues. In South Africa, PW both had refused to honor the invitation of the commission. In Nigeria, the generals, as they are called, General Shagari and Abubakar and the rest of them refused to honor the invitation of the commission, showing the commission as a toothless bulldog. When you use a subpoena power against someone and yet you are unable to follow through on it, you have trouble about the limits of the power of law. And when you invite and they do not come, and you have the subpoena power to compel them, and you do not use it, it also raises questions about your competence or your courage as an institutional operator to make good use of the resources at your disposal. So managing public expectations is also another one in terms of public participation. In Ghana, the commission was appointed by, the 9-member commission was appointed by the president on the advice of a body called the Council of State, a group of eminent senior citizens that advise the president. And that has been criticized, and I think rightly so. I was appointed by fiat. I was just called by the president. I was minding my business in Tanzania, and I got a call and said, please come and do this job for your country. Now, I would have wished that it was an open advertisement that I had applied for and participated in, and if successful and appointed, would have done it. That would have brought with it a greater sense of legitimacy. The appointment of the commissioners by the precedent gave the impression that these are hand-picked individuals who were going to do the bidding. And I think that the supporters of the former president were legitimately concerned, and rightly so, in at least holding that perception. In Liberia, however, where the counterfoil of the Ghanaian experience took place, that is strong public participation in the selection process. Civil society had great participation in the selection of the commissioners. But from my standpoint, it was a disaster because civil society in Liberia was severely desiccated and largely discredited because the war had eroded much of the moral and social infrastructure of the country. And a lot of people, lobbied and bullied and cajoled and did all manner of things in order to get themselves nominated by civil society leaders so that they would get on the commission. And it has been a very problematic commission in terms of composition and the ability of the members to work together. The Ghana Commission remains today. I mean, the members remain very close friends. It's almost like a club. They worked in harmony. I was with them every day, and there was never conflict. The commission took a vote only twice in almost 2 years of existence, unlike in South Africa. And you read the publications of Desmond Tutu, and most especially Dr. Alex Borah, the vice chair of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in his book, A Nation Unmarked, A Country Unmarked. And you see the challenges that they had to go through because of dissent and dissension within the ranks of the commission, because of the different political colorings and backgrounds that the members brought to the table. Managing that dialogue on the establishment and on the passage of the act, the appointment of the chief executive and the members, all of these are problems. Managing also the public participation in terms of statement taking. Even stepping back, recruiting competent staff. A Truth Commission work is a short-term, time-bound process. You need people who are ready. And by all means, you must train people 3 months during your preparatory phase as you are setting up. You must give training to people to go and take statements and to go and investigate and to go and educate the public and all of that. But that's not what I'm talking about. I am talking about a strong attitudinal and professional infrastructure within the country and within the person to get up and be running with the job. In our case, for example, we advertised and we couldn't get a single woman in Ghana to apply for the position of investigator. And virtually every investigator we had, not virtually, every single investigator we had was a retired police officer. And the police are themselves persons who had been severely implicated in human rights violations. So how do you ensure that this is a police officer with no human rights violation, record of human rights violation, to do that job? And how do you ensure that there will be public confidence in the ability of this person to do the job impartially? The same with statement taking the statements of the victims. Again, who are you going to get to do that? This is a lower level job. You get young university students, most of whom did not experience, young people who were not born or who were babies at the time these atrocities were occurring, and who lack the ability or the basis to empathize, unless, of course, they have read widely or somehow you train them very well. The public hearings themselves. What format were you going to use? Are you going to have it like this, like the courtroom scenario, where you have a horseshoe bay arrangement? Judges, the commissioner sitting here as judges, the witness sitting in the middle and facing this panel? Or are you going to have a gachacha type of thing, a round table kind of arrangement, where you level up, everybody sitting on the same level, rather than on a podium, up like this kind of arrangement? What kind of formal arrangement would best enable you to elicit the information you need? What kinds of counseling services are you going to provide to the people who are going to testify, some of whom are going to break down, some of whom are going to collapse at the sheer weight of the process of recollecting subdued or repressed memory? How do you provide security for such persons after they have testified and embarrassed a big man or big woman and have to go back to their homes? What kind of security assessment, risk assessment, do you do as they leave the premises They may be oblivious. They may not be even aware that what they had said jeopardizes their lives. What kind of transportation arrangements do you provide for these people? I think also that one of the most difficult challenges in a Truth Commission work is the business of taming the media. This is hot news. Every embarrassing story that is told at a Truth Commission sells a newspaper or increases listenership or viewership. And the media showed great interest at the beginning of the Commission's work. But as it became more and more mundane, as the people became a little bit desensitized after watching the televised proceedings for a while, not the public, but the media, the stories were the same. Every rape, every killing, every disappearance or torture, you could see the common trait, the traits, or the undercurrent, the currents that ran through them. It was getting boring. And the media is the business, first and foremost, of making money. We don't kid ourselves on that. And so interest began to wane. But interest would shoot up whenever a big political fish was appearing before the Commission. Again, showing the media's own self-interest and bias and reporting inclinations. But training the media even before the Commission started its work was important. Making sure that they understand that covering a Truth Commission proceeding is different than covering the proceedings of a trial in court, O.J. Simpson style. It is fundamentally different, and it's important that they do not over-sensationalize proceedings and all of that. Initially, they seem to do well, but later on, in order to outdo each other and get on top of the sales scale, they reverted, some of them, to the traditional media practices. Managing civil society demands, the gender community, victims, special interest groups, ex-soldiers, in the case of Liberia, ex-combatants, ex-detainees, all kinds of X's emerged, each seeking attention and jostling for recognition, for acknowledgement, and for pride of place, and also for recognition that their tale of woe is greater than the other person's. The proper use of the powers of subpoena was also a challenge. And how do you balance the obligation? Because our act, and in South Africa it was the same, in Liberia it is the same, in Sierra Leone it is the same, in East Timor, in all truth commissions, contemporary truth commissions, there is an obligation to name names, to tell who did what to whom, when, why, and where. All of those critical questions, but especially who did it? And naming names, in my view, is one of the most potent tools of truth commissions, and it stands as a great counterfoil to the charge of allowing impunity to continue. When people see that their names are going to be in this permanent historical record, they are concerned and they want to come forward and debunk or debunk the allegations or defend themselves against it. But naming names is a tool of accountability. How far do you go with it? Should you name names? And if you fail to name names, will you be living up to the constitutional or the statutory obligation that has been placed on you? I think that there are challenges in conducting hearings, sometimes over-judicialization. That was one of the charges in Ghana, that our process was excessively judicial-like, almost like a court proceedings, and that it had a capacity to intimidate. And finally, I think one of the greatest challenges in the work of a Truth Commission is building the capacity of the commission members themselves. Often, they are people who are accomplished in life, selected primarily because of their accomplishments and their ability to do the work that they were doing. But coming to do a Truth Commission work is an entirely different kettle of fish. And it's hard sometimes to teach, what do they say, an old dog new tricks. I thank you for your attention.
Great speakers we've just listened to. It's now time for our interactive session, and I invite the two speakers here.
Okay.
Right.
You can use the Q&A mics in the audience to ask our speakers a question. Both of you indicated at one point or another that there might be some better time for reconciliation than others. I know you mentioned the Liberians perhaps not being ready, Professor Ken, and Ambassador Smith. I know that the initial attempts in Fiji were actually met with a coup. So that probably wasn't a very opportune time to go about. Should there be distance between an event and reconciliation, or is moving forward the best policy? Thank you.
So you want to start off?
Thank you, sir. Truth commissions are traditionally part and parcel of the arrangements for transiting from a period of dictatorship or prolonged conflict or authoritarian rule to a period of peace and democracy. And so, by definition, as a transitional justice arrangement, it must take place at the onset of the peace-making process. As in the case of Liberia, it was part of the comprehensive peace agreement that was struck or designed in Accra in order to end the conflict. But I think that from my vantage point in the Liberian situation, that whilst the peace agreement provided for the Truth Commission, I think the establishment of the Truth Commission itself should have been delayed a little bit until some measure of normalcy had returned to Liberia. And because the people are just not there, by and large, the infrastructure is not there, but unless Liberia goes all over the world trying to talk to Liberians in the diaspora, and especially in the United States, and they try to do that in the eastern, in the New England states and the eastern corridor quite a bit, and in Minnesota. But it is an expensive enterprise, and I think that letting a bit of time go by, a couple of years after the peace process, is helpful. I think from the Ghanaian experience, which didn't happen, and it's unique, I'm not trying to construct one jacket, one size fit all kind of garment, but I think that we have to look at every situation in its own broad context. But letting a little bit of breathing space is useful. I think my people say that, you know, when you are in the bush and you are tackled by ants, you don't stand in the midst of the ants and try to remove the ants from your body. You move aside and then you try to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. For our case in Fiji, it was felt that perhaps we had embarked on this journey a bit too early, simply because there was still a lot of hurt and a lot of pain that was still evident in society when the Truth and Reconciliation Bill was taken to the nation. Basically, what had occurred was this. In 2000, a group of civilians with a small group of military personnel took government hostage for about 56 days. The military managed to secure the release of these hostages, and what had occurred was, in that process, a mutiny had also occurred in the barracks. So one of the major players in this bill was the military, which felt aggrieved by the incidents of 2000 and 2001. And the bill called for the amnesty of those soldiers that had participated in the hostage-taking in government. And I think it was too early for us to be talking amnesty at that stage, because there was still a lot of hurt, especially within the military hierarchy. And they would not have allowed the release of former soldiers who had been punished through the military courts to be granted amnesty in this new bill. So I think the time was a bit too early also for us.
Thank you. Well, I'm waiting for someone else to come up. I'm also curious to know, you have, both of you represent societies that have both very traditional elements, rural elements that are quite distinct in many ways from the urban elements or more recently introduced immigrant populations? Is there a way to create reconciliation that works for both populations?
I think for us it's a matter of education, educating both of the major races on the benefits of living together and of educating our children on what it takes to be a nation. As I mentioned this morning, we are still struggling from 1970, when we gained independence, on trying to cultivate or create this image of a national identity in Fiji. Unlike in the States where you're known basically as Americans, in the Fijian context, you're addressed either as a Fijian, which identifies you as a indigenous person, or an Indo-Fijian, given the background of the indentured laborers that we had. So that is a struggle that we're facing, and it's through education that we perhaps can bring the two races together.
I'm not sure I appreciated your question, sir, but again, in the case of Ghana, Ghanaian rural society was difficult to reach in terms of the reconciliation, but there were no peculiar issues other than simply the problem of reaching rural communities. We were aided by a phenomenon, the growth of civil society in Ghana in recent times. The last 10 years, there's been such an explosion of civil society initiatives or activities. Radio stations, there are about 10 years ago when I returned to Ghana, there were just about a dozen radio stations in the country. Today, there are over 145 at the last count. There are more than 140 private newspapers in the country. Newspapers, including government-controlled ones. And so, especially through the medium of radio, reaching the countryside wasn't difficult. But as I said earlier, transporting people from very rural areas, providing transport, cash, for them to attend hearings was a problem. But I'm not sure that I appreciated your question, but that was it with respect to rural communities.
Good evening. I was wondering if, prior to your respective efforts, there were any attempts at truth and reconciliation, either Ghana or Fiji?
Whether there was any
attempts at truth or reconciliation prior to your efforts in either Ghana or Fiji?
In Fiji's case, it was our first attempt at national reconciliation. Traditionally, societies had reconciled amongst themselves, significantly the indigenous Fijian society. But at the national level, this was our first stab at this new phenomenon of reconciliation, contemporary reconciliation.
I think, in the case of Ghana, there were previous attempts at reconciliation before the establishment of the National Reconciliation Commission. I'm the first to point out that the former President Rawlings, Jerry John Rawlings, who ruled Ghana on two different occasions, and during whose governance a lot of violations occurred. He apologized to the nation on two separate occasions. But the apologies were widely considered to be inadequate, especially also because it was not followed with any concrete gestures that would make people feel that there was a sense of remorse. For example, in the same contest when he apologized and people asked him if he was going to return the country to constitutional rule soon, he immediately retorted, hand over to whom? He had taken the country from a previous government, but he retorted, hand over to whom? Giving the impression that, he had no remorse and he thought that he was the only person who could presumably rule the country. It wasn't a conciliatory or a reconciliatory statement. But in fairness to him, in addition to apologizing, the National Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice had within its law the power to return some of the assets, the properties that were confiscated by the state to their rightful owners if those persons made an application to the commission, and it investigated it and felt that they should be returned. Third, the former president also set up what was called Assets Disposal Committee, again, to return the properties of people to them. And a lot of people whose assets, some people whose assets had been confiscated, took advantage of it. The problem with that was that it was ad hominem, it was person to person, it was not widely broadcast or advertised, and it was used as a way of buying back the loyalties and support of people. In other words, showing gratitude. You know, I seized your property, you come, you beg, I give it back to you, you know, we sort of make up. But the National Reconciliation Commission was an institutionalized process, an open one, transparent, broad-based, and one whose doors were open to everyone, unlike the selective reconciliatory moves of the earlier times. Yes.
Yes, you've spoken a bit about the challenges and the requirements for reconciliation. I was hoping to hear your views on the outcomes of your respective reconciliation processes and then the potential for your states into the future, please.
Thank you. Our first effort, as I mentioned, resulted in the military intervening in the affairs of the nation on the 5th of December 2006. So that put a premature end to what the government was trying to achieve. The president then appointed an interim government that is currently ruling Fiji, and there is a process called the National Council for Building a Better Fiji. This council basically has the task to undertake a holistic look at all the problems that are plaguing the country, not only addressing the incident of 2000, but also incidents, historical incidents, things like the racially based voting system that we have, the communally based systems, trying to find a national identity for us in Fiji. So it has now set up this commission that's mandated by the president, and hopefully come March next year, when Fiji is due to go to elections, that we will have a compact ready for the people to be able to identify what we want for ourselves now and perhaps charting the way for the future.
In the case of Ghana, I think that there have been a few outcomes that are positive. For one, government has government, first of all, accepted all the recommendations made by the Commission and promised to implement all of them. It has implemented a monetary compensation component of our recommendations. And all those persons who were, by and large, I'm not sure that it is to the last person, but most of the people who were to be beneficiaries of a compensation package have so benefited. Government was also expected to implement recommendations that would, what we call symbolic reparations, that would constitute expression of the country's acceptance of the pain that people had suffered, and to acknowledge that, and to, for example, build hospitals or engage in symbolic reparations, build hospitals, build monuments, build name streets after people, after victims, and the rest of them. All those ones remain to be done. I should say, however, that the Commission also did institutional hearings. We didn't just hear individual complaints. We heard from, we heard about the activities of various sectors of society in human rights violations, traditional authorities, the military, the police, the student movement, the legal profession, and other such groups, the trade unions. And so all of these sectors have had some recommendations made about them, and some of them are trying to implement them in hopes that we never experience some of the violations we experienced in the past. Those are some of the outcomes of the Commission. But above all, it is that document that stands as a permanent monument to the will of the people to say, never should this happen to us again.
thank both of you honorable gentlemen for your time tonight. I would like to ask you your perspective on Latin America, because I study Latin America, and I've seen sort of several human rights violations that have occurred through several dictatorships in both Central America and South America. So I was wondering if it takes a certain type or a certain structure or a certain age of a society to implement a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or if that's something that could be universal, though culturally sensitive to each one.
Thank you. I'll be very truthful here. I don't have any experience in Latin America, so I'll defer to the more experienced member of the panel.
I would, thank you, sir. I would, I would say that, no, the Truth Commission is not peculiar to any particular region of the world. Indeed, countries such as Germany and Canada have all implemented Truth Commissions. Greensboro, South Carolina in the United States is implementing a Truth Commission. When I give out a list of countries, I forgot to mention the United States. It's so huge. But Greensboro, the township or the city of Greensboro, trying to reconcile itself with the past egregious violations with respect to racism and lynchings and that sort of cross-banning and the rest of them. But contemporary Truth Commissions, as we know them, are a gift from Latin America. You know, it was Latin American countries, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and of course in the Caribbean, Haiti and others, that gave us the first modern-day Truth Commissions. And the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission itself was modeled on the Argentinian, Chilean experiences. Of course, the extent to which they succeeded is another matter. In some of those, as in Argentina, for example, there were no naming of names. In some of them, and therefore the allegation is that it allowed impunity to thrive. In some of those commissions, the recommendations were not implemented and there was nothing binding. In some of those commissions, the Latin American ones, the commissions were appointed as a result of a policy decision. And so the policy could any day be simply scrapped, which is why Truth Commissions of the modern day are based on parliamentary enactment, legislation, which cannot easily be, as it were, thrown away. And there is often a provision in the Act that the recommendations should be binding or something should happen to the recommendations, that at minimum they must be published. In some of the Latin American cases, the reports were kept on the shelves to gather dust. But Truth Commissions that have come to us from Latin America enabled the African National Congress to hold a Truth Commission in-house to examine its own atrocities against fellow South Africans and even foreigners, and in the lands in which they were operating during the anti-apartheid struggles. Similarly, Uganda, Idi Amin investigated Idi Amin. And of course, you can tell what it was. But once Idi Amin was out of the way, in 1986, Uganda established a very credible Truth Commission called a Commission of Inquiry into Human Rights Violations in that country. Nigeria has done it. Morocco also again has done a Truth Commission fairly recently after Ghana and Chile's and Peru's. And Peru's is the most recent example of a Truth Commission. At the last count, Mexico was exploring the possibility. But Truth Commission is not for every country. Angola looked at it and said, we ain't going to touch it, and it's too risky trying to expose the past. Namibia looked at it. Mozambique is doing just fine, and it didn't have a Truth Commission. So, yes. Thank you.
I know there was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I know you presented a report, and maybe I don't know where it is, but I'll be grateful if you could elaborate on how you make some of these reports available to the common public and to most people. Secondly, in the issue of reconciliation, we have those who are offended and those who commit the offense. I'd like to know what happens to those who commit the offense, because so far I've been listening and we compensate people and things like that, but I don't know what happens to those who commit the offense. Is it just they coming to say, I'm sorry, and that's it? I don't know, I'm just asking.
You go ahead, sir.
Thank you. The question of publicity, I mean, sometimes I'm baffled by the conduct of politicians. In the context of Ghana, it is expensive. Ghana is not a rich country. It has struck oil, yes, but we haven't seen a barrel of it yet. But the Ghana government has found money to pay the compensations that were recommended to the victims. But it hasn't yet apologized to the Ghanaian women folk for the egregious violations they suffered. It hasn't built the markets, which would cost money, but very little. It hasn't, established the counseling units at the hospitals that were recommended. There are things it hasn't done. And one of them is that it has not publicized the recommendations of the commission or the report of the commission. In our report, based on the experiences of Latin America, we recommended that the report should be widely distributed. That first, it should be child-friendly versions of it should be created. User-friendly versions should be created. Every primary school should have a copy of the report. It should be made like a little booklet, by the National Commission for Civic Education, the Commission on Human Rights and Administrative Justice, and the Ministry of National Orientation. They should publicize these things. They haven't done it. In anticipation that government may fail to do this, we took it upon ourselves to make copies of the report available once we had given it to the president to every university in the country. And at that time, I think there were about 15 universities in the country at the time in 2004. And we made sure that they all got copies of the report. We also made sure that what in Ghana we call identifiable bodies, all kinds of civil society groups, professional bodies, and the rest of them, were given copies. To government's credit, it has published the executive summary of the report, the volume 1 of the report. It's a 5-volume report, but the volume 1 has been published on the Ghana government website, and it's available. You simply do www.ghanagovernment.org, and it's there. But it has not done what it should have done that we expected it to do with respect to publicity largely. Perpetrators, what happens to them? It is the big question that I alluded to at the beginning about truth versus justice. There are people who don't support truth commissions because they think that it chickens out and it gives liberties to perpetrators and perhaps pats them on the back, because all it does is to say, well, you've been mentioned as a perpetrator. Whether you respond or not, we have found out you are a perpetrator. We've written it in our report, and that's the end of it. And you leave it to their consciences. But not everybody has conscience. And there are people who may not be persuaded to desist from violations simply because their names may be published, if immediately violating rights would give them benefits, confiscating assets or torturing people, killing to cover up, and the rest of them. But I think that in the case of Ghana, again, and I think in South Africa, President de Klerk made the same point yesterday. In my view, if the ANC of South Africa had insisted on a Nuremberg-style prosecution of the former apartheid leaders, South Africa would have slipped into bloodshed or a revolution. At the same time, if the former apartheid leaders, President de Klerk and Botha and the rest of them, had also insisted on large-scale amnesty, forgiveness, non-prosecution for every one of the former leaders, the negotiations for the transition to democracy would also have collapsed. And again, we would have witnessed bloodshed. In Ghana, if we had recommended the prosecution, of the former president or of some of his close associates, whom we found to have masterminded the killings of the 3 High Court judges and the Army Major in 1982, or who we believe had immediate knowledge of it immediately after it happened, if we had recommended the prosecution of Rawlings for participating in or watching and not doing anything about extrajudicial killings at the Air Force Base and things like that, Ghana would have imploded, because former President Rawlings is a powerful political figure with a very large following that sometimes gets is dedicated and ready to fight for any cause in which he is involved. And I say that because on the day he was compelled to testify before the commission, there were more than 30,000 supporters there at the premises of the old Parliament House where the hearings took place. And they were ready to do anything. Rawlings is a powerful force. I am not talking about playing wimp to leaders. But you see, even if you recommend a prosecution and he's prosecuted, the head of state has the prerogative of mercy. The head of state of every country, President George Bush, can grant pardon to anyone. So immediately after conviction, he can pardon the person, and you will not see the inside of a jail. To what purpose? Now, it is wonderful to have the might of a giant, but it is tyrannical to use it like a giant.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sir, perhaps your last question?
Okay, so we just take the last two questions. The lady behind you, is she? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, so we just take the last two questions, and the rest can stay and interact with our speakers. Thank you.
Yeah, Kenya escaped so many instances that it would have erupted. 1969, 1982, after the coup, and even and recently it faced a situation that has been there, that happened because it was never handled correctly when the Kenyan leader had an opportunity to do so. But but currently what they're doing right now, they are very much engaged in facilitating the leaders from different opposition, from different tribe, rather than engaging in inner community in terms of helping the people who have been displaced, in terms of renovating the internal security to a standard whereby they can avoid any further crashes between the community. And my question then goes, what do you think is relevant for a country to focus more on how they can accommodate the leaders, or rather than the people themselves?
I think Kenya faces a peculiar situation. As far back as 2002, I was approached to assist Kenya in designing a framework for a truth commission. Those discussions remain tentative, not with respect to me, but with respect to the whole Kenyan society and reconciliation. When that discussion moved into a bit of top gear, then we had the elections, and then we had a catastrophe that has befallen Kenya. I think immediately Kenya is doing the right thing. I think that Kenya is trying to deal with the problem of a leadership crisis. There is a particular problem which must engage the attention of the country. And once that is resolved, I mean, to the extent that I use the word resolve advisedly, to the extent that that is handled adequately and securely, Kenya can move on to the broader question of trying to look into its past and trying to go into it. And so the recent peace agreement that was reached goes beyond just power sharing between the president and what's his name?
Odinga.
Yes, and Odinga. There is a comprehensive package, but it's step by step, one day at a time.
Although the problem is that the package, the demands between the two may go for actually a year. And in the process, we still have people who are now living in the refugee. They don't have anything specifically, they don't have the shelters. And they don't even have even resources on providing their own food.
So then that becomes two problems. What you are suggesting is either a deficit in the attention levels of the UNHCR, I mean the international community, and also of the Kenyan government. The Kenyan government has a responsibility. There is a government in place, and it has a responsibility to deal with the crisis of those on whom it has foisted misery. But Kenya cannot, despite its being a great country in many respects, Kenya cannot deal with the problem that it has on its hands, and it needs support from the United Nations.
Ma'am, you have the last question.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I just wanted to know if the former president in Ghana, if he ever came forward to deny any of the accusations that the people came forward with?
The former president was compelled or subpoenaed. He was compelled to come before the commission, yes. But he was compelled to come and produce a video recording of an extrajudicial killing of the extrajudicial killing of about 18 people that had been videotaped and he had watched. And we had evidence that he had watched the killings. We had reason to believe that he was present, but we invited him to come and, give us the video. He came and he said that he didn't have it, that he watched it for about 5 minutes, lost interest, and called his bodyguard and gave it to him. And where is the bodyguard? He was dead. And dead men, and it's true he was dead. And dead men don't talk. He had also been the last person to interview a person who was a member of his government and a long-term personal friend who was tried and convicted for the abduction and murder of 3 High Court judges and a retired major, a military officer in June 1982. And again, he went to him and audio recorded what was said to be a confession, and which was also played to a number of journalists. And we wanted to hear the tape. So we invited him for those 2 things. He did attend, and he said that he listened to it, but again, he gave it to the man who was dead. So, but because we compelled him to come under pain of a subpoena, sub poena, under penalty, we brought him there, and when he came and he said he didn't have it, there was nothing else we could ask him, because a subpoena requires, you have to live within the law. We had to be lawful. And it caused a lot of confusion in Ghanaian society because people thought that when he came, we didn't give him an opportunity to answer the allegations. That was not the occasion. That opportunity was given to him 13 times earlier, and he didn't take advantage of it. And we were not going to give him what he didn't deserve. Thank you very much.